Hello and good morning. We have a wonderful panel here who have had lots of experience in different languages. 4 different languages are being translated from into English. So they have a lot to say. So without much ado, let's get into the session itself because the clock is ticking. So I want to, in random order, maybe with you, Radha. Yeah. What brought you to translation? And this is something I will ask all of you. Because translation, from my experience, is something that we get into a little bit later, is it? In our journeys as writers, as whatever else we're doing, in our original languages. So could we please begin with you?
I think the beginning came from the fact that I'm bilingual, at least bilingual, but actually, like most Indians, I have a smattering of at least 4 or 5 languages, and that is true of most people from our culture. At the same time, my education from right from preschool to university was in English. The medium of instruction was English. So I think what happened was growing up in a household where one was speaking, reading, listening to my mother tongue Bengali, and then also speaking, reading, and learning Hindi because I grew up outside Bengal in Delhi. And then being educated in English, I felt a disconnect between different areas of my life, and I felt that in my education and professional world and in the world of my academic practice, something was being suppressed and some part of me needed to articulate itself. I also felt, coming from a multilingual culture like India, that translation is essential for dialogues to take place between languages within our own culture and also to take that culture out internationally into the outside world. I think that's what brought me into translation.
Yes, that is true for, I think, all of us in many ways, and especially, I would say, those of us who live in India and we have to negotiate so many languages in the course of a single day, whether written or spoken. So what about you, Olga, who translates from Polish into English? Yes. And Radha is from Bangla into English.
Thank you. Thank you, Mitra, and thank you, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. And in my case, regarding your question, I think that it was the internet when I think about it. Yes, that it wasn't my education, that I think that it wasn't my environment, because Poland is an incredibly monolingual country, and it's only recently that everybody is speaking English, and Polish is turning into like a mixture of Polish and English very rapidly. But when I think about it, like my coming of age coincided with the earliest days of common access to the internet, and it also was linked to like a rush towards voluntary work, also regarding translation. That I think that many people became voluntarily involved in cultural exchange. And trying to translate films, film scripts, books, or other like cultural texts otherwise unavailable for Polish audience, or the other way around, that we were trying to distribute. Yes, that we were trying to distribute potentially interesting Polish works worldwide. And I think that it was like my online presence and my online life that turned me into like a daily bilingual person. And I think that I actually owe the most to the internet.
That's very interesting. I've never heard this explanation before. I don't know if you all have, that I owe my life as a translator to the internet. Wonderful. Yeah. That's a validation. Nashwa, please, Nashwa.
Thank you very much, Mitra. Again, also very, very happy to be here today. So I think I share a little bit probably with everyone. I grew up obviously bilingual too, to Egyptian parents. I grew up in Kuwait and then in the UK. And we were immigrants to the UK. So, you know, there was a lot of translation involved in kind of sometimes explaining concepts to my parents, even though they both could speak English. But then I was a journalist for many years. I worked for Al Jazeera when the English channel was first launched. I was one of the launch team. And translation was a big part of it then because I was so proud to work for a platform that was showing what was actually happening in the Middle East to the English-speaking world. So it came as early as that. And then I got a lot of opportunities being an Arabic speaker in the new channel to be interviewing and going on assignments in the Middle East and then translating those interviews. But translating literature didn't come till a little bit later when I returned to the UK. And I found that the UK has all these opportunities for emerging translators in literature. Wonderful organization, the British Centre for Literary Translation, which works with very closely with the National Centre for Writing. So I was awarded the Emerging Mentorship in 2014. And through that, I was mentored and then I met colleagues. And the best way that kind of progressed the translation after that was all the wonderful collaborations with other translators from then on. So now I'm sort of one of the people who's helping to deliver those kinds of programs to emerging translators.
How wonderful. And what a variety of experiences. So now we come to Michael, German, who geographically is probably closest to, but you stay in England. So tell us a little bit of how you were formed as a translator.
Well, hello, good morning. I was a writer. I wrote poems. I wrote book reviews. I was freelance, and this was before the things that Nashwa mentioned. Before anything like that existed, there were no English institutions. I'm much older than any institution, and I was looking for something that would keep me occupied for more than a day, in the case of a poem, a week, in the case of a book review. And I'd had the experience of receiving my first book of poems in the post and sort of throwing it up in the air, and it being so light, I thought it would never come down. So I've always been interested in mass, in bulk, in mortification. My father was a German novelist. We spoke German at home. I too, among the rest of us, was bilingual. I mean, it's interesting that none of us really learned a language. Although it was my feeling that being bilingual is actually not a great start to translating, because you are used to being understood, whatever your language is. But I love the word, the delicate art of translating. I think what I do is a little bit like what convicts do, which is you're given a toothbrush and you clean out a yard, and that is translating. It's something about, it's a sort of superfine activity.
Yes, this is what is said about Michael, and I must read it out, that he is the most influential translator from German to English. So no matter how humble your words are, I mean, this remains. So I would like to ask, maybe you, because you're right next to me, you translate, and I'm so sorry we should have hours actually, but we only have 45 minutes. So anyway, Radha, you translate from Bangla into English, and you have translated a lot of Tagore, a lot of Qazi Nazrul Islam, and you have been an academic as well. So I find, because I know a little bit of Bangla, that how, the lyricism of Tagore and English is a very, I would say, cut and dried kind of a language. At least that's what I find, because we come from colorful languages, right? Arabic and everything. I don't know about Polish though. Anyway, so how do you negotiate that?
I think one way or the other, every translator faces the
This
gap
problem.
between the two languages they work across. It's certainly true that Bangla, the cadences, the nuances, and the vocabulary is far removed from those aspects.
Especially
of
Tagore,
English.
I would think.
Especially Tagore, and especially Tagore as a poet.
Yeah.
But this is equally true of prose writers as
As
well. So yes, it is an additional challenge, but I think that's where translation becomes more than a mechanical activity of simply transferring a text like a parcel that you put in the postbox and it arrives at an address. It's not like that. Literary translation is in its own right a creative act.
I'm
It
so
is in
glad you
its
said
own
that.
right
yeah.
a creative act. And it requires immense imagination and resourcefulness on the part of the translator. But it also requires immersion in the literary languages of both cultures. Because translation, before you begin to translate, it's an intimate act of reading. I think translation
Multiple times.
is the most intimate way that you can read a text.
Absolutely. And what I always say is that the translator knows a good, competent translator knows what the author is trying to say better than anybody, right?
Try, you have to try.
You have to try. Yeah. So, Olga, this was fascinating because your background is anthropology and you are working with objects which are, tell us a little bit more about that and how you use this in your translations or your work, your literary works.
Thank you for your question. I am specializing in social sciences, humanities, and arts. And my work as a translator is very closely tied to what I do as a writer and as a researcher. So I think that these are all complementary areas. Though I think now, I think all the questions that you are asking also other participants made me think about my way as a translator and the fact that I have begun with translating like prominent works of European and American counterculture that weren't available in Polish. So I've begun with experimental works and only later moved on to academic pieces. But I think that it all really like feeds my experience. And but when it comes to my work with objects, when I heard what you said, Radha, I thought that a translator's work is a bit similar to an actor's work as well, because they have to somehow sense and connect with mind and sensibility with the intentions of the author and the intention of the work. And I think that it's not really much different when you work with an academic text. It's not as dry as it might seem on the surface, because you also need to engage a certain kind of feeling into this work. And I think that the same thing refers to working with objects, that it's not merely a description, but it's experience. And I think that writing about objects and translating pieces that refer to the way we use and we live with objects, they require like engaging experience.
That's so interesting. Yeah. And what about you? I've been really fascinated by your work. I know you have written a lot before and after, but tell us about your work for this project with the refugees who came, and there was a workshop and they all wrote their own stories and you translated them. Tell us about it. Must have been a very intense experience. Please tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, yeah, of course. You're talking about Shatila Stories that was published with Pairini Press a few years ago. I agree. I've worked on a lot of other projects, but that was one of my favorites. And
this is what leapt up at me when I was, doing your background.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing it up because it was very special and it was a very impactful project as well. So I was brought on in a really early stage. Normally, you're contacted by a publisher to say, would you like to translate this manuscript? Or most often, the translators are the ones who are pitching to the publishers. But in this case, they got in touch saying, we've run a series of workshops on creative writing for refugees in the Shatila camp in Lebanon. We have extracted some of the best sections of what they have written over a period of, I think it was about 3 months of back and forth writing. And a lot of them were amateurs. They were either very new to creative writing or very new to workshopping. And they said, could you just translate these excerpts and we're going to turn them into a book. But they said, take all the liberty that you want in this case. So I tried to be as faithful as possible to their voices, to each of their voices. And the stories were very raw and based on truth, really, their actual real lived experiences. But they were fictionalized to a certain extent. And then I worked very closely with the publisher and the editor, and the publisher herself was a novelist. So she took all of these. We had a couple of discussions, and she found a way to merge all of their stories to turn it into a novel. So, she turned certain characters became siblings or partners or so we became part of this creative process together, and as a maker, that was a very special.
I can imagine. That's really very interesting. And the other thing I would like to actually ask you, but also, the rawness of that experience to translate it into English, which is a much more, what shall I say, a kind of that rawness is not there, I find. So that must have been difficult, maybe.
I mean, it was, some of the difficulties were, the dialect, for example, especially in one of them was very, very heavy dialect. And, I had to ask around lots of friends just to find somebody who spoke that kind of Palestinian country dialect. But also at the same time, I didn't want to, gloss over. I didn't want to, lose the fact that this voice was so unique and different. So it was just one of the challenges. I had to find a way to keep each person's voice. And when I was translating each one, I tried to enter that writer's mind as well, as well as the characters whenever we were talking about the dialogue, to make sure that it did still reflect that kind of uniqueness and the rawness still came through. But I mean, English is one of those languages that does kind of wipe out.
Homogenizes a lot of things, yes.
But at the same time, a lot of my work recently has been looking at ways in which we can bring that back in. So, for example, instead of shortening all the sentences and capping everything, keeping, being friends with the comma, keeping the long sentences, keeping the rhythm.
Friends with the comma, right? Yeah. Okay. Yes, that's really nice. Michael, you are a poet. And you translate poetry, which is really very difficult. And you're also a critic and an editor. Do these works kind of sometimes clash with each other? I'm sure they don't, but tell us about how.
I really don't think so. I mean, I put myself last. I mean, whatever I write under my own name is last, and otherwise, I just try and make everything come out as nicely as possible. Yes, English is it's peculiar writing to the service and the greater glory of English. But it's so important because otherwise one is the English of whom I'm most aware, to some extent the Americans, become sort of secluded by their own experiences, become solipsistic, are aware of nothing else, have no passports, have increasingly little interest in the world, and so it's terribly important to do. I mean, especially more distant languages. I mean, German is a sort of neighbor country. I mean, Brexit has happened, so England, in a sense, has no neighbours anymore. But you foist your own work on the reader, and try and find as many readers for these alien products as you can.
Yes, and the other thing that I was interested in when we were talking is that you were growing up as somebody freshly come from Germany into the England of the 60s, post-war, and having to negotiate these two languages, which were very inimical to each other at that time. Could you tell us?
Yes, I mean, it was the sort of the Donner and Blitzen period in England, which to some extent still continues. I mean, I think vis-a-vis the English approach towards German unification, that Mrs. Thatcher was sort of on the whole against it, and that the French liked Germany so much they preferred to have two of them. So, I mean, England has long been used to having a say in Europe, and basically, to me, as a small boy in the 60s, it was an enemy language, and it would be known of one that one spoke German at home, and I really therefore tried to lose it and not be known that I was German. I was ashamed. I was frightened. All the English films of the period were sort of war movies, and it was a kind of a time of penitence. I was doing penance for my own wicked country.
Oh dear.
That's fine.
But anyway, but thank you for saying that. For being so open about it. Yeah. So here, to the practice of translation from all the varied languages, which are so different from the target language for all of us is English, and our source languages are all so very different. So I would like to ask each one of you that what are the specific challenges you technically you faced as a translator? This time we'll begin with Michael and come down this way.
I've sort of become through translating. I've become a kind of friend of lost causes, and one such lost cause is the presence in English of French and Latin, especially Latin words. And I think when I was sort of 15 or something at school, I became a really smitten with the Latin words in English, which are the words that people get wrong. In the end, there will be one word. There will be one Latin word left, which will be, and it will have a meaning like to feel bad or making somebody feel bad, and it'll be decimate or something like that. I was decimated. So I like these words, and I like the idea of holding English to kind of bygone standards. A difficulty. I mean, German is a conjugated and declined language. It has a sort of a tu form and a vous form. Du, sie. That doesn't exist in English. There is a powerful comma, so you can sort of keep sentences going. The Americans call it comma splicing, and they consider it wrong. But I've done a lot of that. The Germans don't mark speech. There are no speech marks, or speech marks are optional, and I hold with that sometimes. So that you pay attention to the sentence, and is somebody speaking, or is it just the narrator's voice? It's usually possible to tell. And I like doing that. It's an element of, again, foisting about that. I mean, German is also notorious for being able to pair long words together and make sort of neologisms, but neologisms which everyone can understand, and that's something that you can't really do in English to any great effect. But you do what you can. You try and make sense. You try and put the reader in the picture, and that's really it. And my own difficulties, because culturally it's so much closer to England, to the US than others of your languages. It's not that hard.
So culturally, the differences are not, they are much more accessible to the reader in English. I would say that.
Absolutely. I kind of have a way of sort of poo-pooing the difficulties, and that it becomes to me the Wurst question and the Schnaps question. Do you say Wurst, or do you say sausage? Do you say Schnaps, or do you say drink, brandy, something like that?
Okay.
And that's a way of banalizing one's difficulties.
Thank you. What about Arabic and?
Yeah, well, I guess Arabic is different because obviously
I know
it comes from one of the Semitic languages, and English is from the Indo-European. So they have very different personalities, let's say. And yeah, we try to sort of bring that across in the translation. So I spoke already about the long lines. Arabic literature is kind of famous for its very long and winding lines, and it's very hard to kind of then turn it into what would be sort of less jarring in English. But we are trying. Also, Arab authors tend to sort of have this fluidity between tenses. So you might have one within one chapter.
We have that in Assamese as well. Yeah.
So yeah, you will flick between present to suddenly we're speaking in the past, and then we come back. And again, editors prefer that we pick one over the other.
Right.
And so that can be tricky. But again, we're trying to kind of reverse that and keep the flavor as much as possible.
You are with the floating tenses?
I
moving
wasn't
tenses
when I was first starting, but now I'm very much back
for
to
it.
Yeah, for like trying to keep, if it was intentional, if it was an author's intention to do my best to try to bring that back in.
You kind of want to mess with English a little bit
exactly,
too, don't you?
Yeah, exactly. We want to get English to fit, into the box rather than the other way around. So there's definitely a bigger, a stronger movement now as well amongst publishers and editors to recognize the source language and, the uniqueness of it as well, which helps, because then you get the support of the people who are actually producing the book. But then there are the similar differences across all of other languages as well, so how do you express, include idiomatic expressions, phrases. In Arabic, we have a lot of religious phrasing that is just very natural. People who don't even necessarily mean it from the religious perspective just use it. Inshallah is probably a very common word.
Which we all use, no matter what our religion.
Yeah, but you kind of also, know that inshallah can have like 5 different meanings. It could be yes, it could be no, it could be maybe, it could be absolutely not. That's never happening.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of having to work with your sentence to make sure that, the intention, is showing in there as well. But I also translate poetry, and I find that actually translating Arabic poetry is a lot trickier because with prose, you have a lot more room to kind of, to add the glosses that you might need to explain something. But with poetry, you have such limited numbers of words and spaces and rhythm that you have to maintain.
Yes, and each word has to carry multiple meanings.
Absolutely.
The weight of
And also with the Arabic language, it's a lot of the words come from 3-letter roots, that can be then extended into lots of other words that are related. So if you know the root, you can start to make these connections when you read all of these other words, but we don't have that in English. And then you have to sort of find ways of inserting it in a different way. But actually the beauty of the Arabic poem is that you didn't need to do that. That was the whole point, that just one word implied so much.
Yes, all the implications have to be, I think for all of us, the implications have to be explained in subtle ways, not make it a lesson or something, but like that. Yeah. Yes.
Just going back to your point as well about the intimacy with the author and the translators being so knowing what the author means. Sometimes I find that it was also actually more than the author themselves.
Often.
Yes, there was an Kuwaiti author we worked with in a workshop, and we sat there for a week-long workshop, and we were workshopping one section from her book. And at one point, she was kind of saying, "You keep asking me all these questions. I don't know why I wrote that. I just wrote it, you know." But we have to get into the mindsets of the authors.
Yes, no, and I completely agree with you, because I have my own novels and short stories, and when they are translated, I find, they have put meanings which, it was probably there, but it was not explicit, and now in the translation it is, which is actually quite wonderful. Yeah. We can come to Olga. Yeah.
Yes.
Polish.
So I have to say that dealing with Polish in translation prompted me to definitely take a second look at my own language, because I think that translating to English has revealed to me a certain embedded formality or embedded, even, so to say, sophistication that I wasn't aware, of course, using Polish as default. And I think that a certain rigidity of grammar, of composition, is revealed in translating to English. And it turns out that it's much more formal, of course, than when I'm using it casually. But now I am aware that, of course, Polish is this kind of language in which even when we swear at each other, we call each other sir and madam. Yeah. So we have a very polite language, actually. And I think that English is much more direct, much more informal, and it allows for more of a free flow of thoughts. These endless sentences in Polish just cannot go on forever, because I think they crash against our grammar. And I think that it is sometimes revealed in translation and back translation. I think it's especially visible with attempts to translate a joke or an anecdote. So a Polish joke in English translation often turns into this extended anecdote with expanded context to every phrase and word and situation. So I think that I have to be very, very aware of that. But I think that, of course, I've learned more about my own language thanks to translation, but I also began to like it more.
Yes, that is a point. And I would like to say, I think all of you will probably agree with me, is that the hardest thing to translate is humor. Yeah, especially from our own languages, which are so rooted in our own cultures, which we easily understand, and the words and everything. So
we don't have that.
Anyway, you're done, Olga? Yeah.
Yes. I wrote a book about humor in Polish. It's my most recent one, but I think that I wouldn't dare, even though it has a lot of international context and references, and it also reveals how many jokes are actually not our local ones, but are adapted. That because humor is a part of folklore, it is everybody's own. It is the world's own, because folklore has this quality that it just goes where it wants, and it travels between people worldwide, and regardless of time and space.
Absolutely.
Yes. But also it is incredibly difficult to translate, because humor is very intuitive in use.
Thank you. And Bangla?
Well,
we did talk a little bit about this, but
we
still,
talked a little bit about this. Let me say not so much about the syntax or the differences between Bangla and English, because of course they're very different. But I want to say that sometimes I feel that the translator doesn't have to explain everything. Sometimes I feel when I'm translating that a book can be allowed to have its own little mysteries and secrets which draw the reader in. Because even when, as children, I was reading books from England, they were from a culture I didn't know. I knew the language, and the children in those books were playing games I didn't know, eating food I didn't know, and but I invented and imagined what that food could be or what those games could be. So sometimes in my translations, I don't always go into too much of trying to make everything transparent to the reader, and sometimes I keep the cultural terms. I keep the name of a season or, the name of a food item. And I say, let the reader guess or imagine and let them be drawn into making meaning of the text so that the reader becomes a participant in the meaning-making process, because translation is not a one-way process. The translator is a mediator. I said in the beginning, it's not a packaged, finished parcel you're handing over. You're drawing the reader into your culture, your different language. And I think we have to respect the reader as someone with their own kind of creative imagination.
Yeah, that is of course true. And when you were talking of, the food, I was remembering, we have, I think my Assamese friends here will agree with me. We have a very everyday fish dish, which we have tenga, and now I always write tenga, okay? But somewhere in the story, I put in words like kanji, fish dish, or, herbs, or something like that. So I think the translator can do these things, which, that freedom is there. I would also like to, before I don't know what time we have. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah. So, as a translator, do all of us feel restricted by the text, or do you feel free? Is there freedom? Because now the translator's name is on the cover of the book, on the spine of the book, which was not there some time ago. People have fought for it, and these are battles that have been won so far. So what I want to know, your feelings on do you feel a sense of freedom as compared to your own writing, or is it restrictive, and why do we do it? I have to ask who. So you. Yeah,
well, I definitely think that a creative writer has more freedom, but therefore maybe, the translator has a greater challenge because you have to work within certain parameters. You can't reinvent the whole text, right? So you are working within that kind of already preset existing prior text, the parameters of that. But I think it's definitely not something that is a mechanical activity. Certainly not. So I feel that you have to take as many liberties as you think will work. And it is, I don't even say get away with. I think you can claim a degree of freedom, without which I think a translation between two languages would be very stilted.
Right.
Very stilted indeed. So I do feel that a translation is a double voice text. And I think the voice of the translator comes through, but we were talking about voicing and bringing alive the voice of the writer.
Right.
But I do think that if you look at parallel translations of the same text by two different translators, they will read differently.
Absolutely.
You will feel the presence of the translator. I do not think that you can entirely invisibilize, or that you should invisibilize, the translator of a literary text.
Very well put. And Olga?
I think that in my field, in the academic works, I think that clarity is the most important quality that I need to have in mind while translating. So I think that it doesn't really involve that much freedom, because I have to think of myself of a mediator or a guide who is explaining something. I think that there are other areas of translation which probably veer more into the area of adaptation that allow for much more freedom. And I have experienced this when I was translating film scripts.
Right.
It felt very, very liberating, yes.
Oh, okay. That freedom was there. Yes.
I agree that obviously if you're writing your own piece of creative work, you have all the freedom, to choose the subject, the content, etc. But actually, I find translation, when the author is really responsive, a beautifully liberating experience because of the collaboration that you can have with them. And I love collaborating on any projects. And when you have a good author who's responsive and who's answering your questions,
Right.
we usually chat sometimes using WhatsApp voice notes, you know, and then, you know, I'm researching the subjects that they have chosen, but it sort of, you know, it gives me, it limits me in a way that I'm not going to go off, you know, down too many rabbit holes and things. And we can have these conversations and debates that become really quite interesting. And then the next level as well, when you're speaking with an editor and you have even more
to explain to them.
Yeah, further. So it's liberating in that sense. It teaches me new things. Like you know, I have an expert to speak to about it. But I don't feel restricted by the process as long as I have a good author that I'm collaborating with.
Yes. Speaking for myself, I try to translate authors who can still respond to my questions, you know, who are alive or who may have passed on, but who have very good relatives or friends who can educate me about what they were thinking, their thought process, and all of that. So yes, I think some kind of knowledge of the working of the translators, of the original writer's mind is required, perhaps, in some way. Yes, Michael?
I think the sort of foundational fact is that not very much does get translated into English. I've translated quite a lot of sort of German classics, 20th century classics, and so occasionally I've things I've done have been done before, or done later, and I have looked at translations of mine, compared them to previous ones, and I mean, even over sort of 5 pages or something, I was really struck to find in one case no case of identical sentence, no identical sentence anywhere in 5 pages. Say as a sample, and I mean, I wasn't trying to be different or irregular or something. Although there's probably more of that now, and I think probably now I mean, it's probably, I'm sort of sensing this here too in the group, that there's that we are sort of rewilding English.
I didn't get that.
That we are rewilding English.
Okay.
I mean, making it say things that it didn't know it wanted to say.
Right. Yes. We translators are, in a way, I mean, this is very arrogant of me to say, but translators are enriching English language, I think, in many ways. Yeah. And anything else you want to add specifically about your own translations or the process of translations? Can translation be taught? You do workshops, Michael?
Yes, I think so. I mean, the other thing about the English, unlike the Indians, the English tend to know one language not all that well, and so you wow, one is sort of up against that, and that makes it's hard to. I mean, I think we've all sort of happen to be sort of washed up there in various ways. We're sort of immigrants, children of immigrants. Things have happened in our lives, and that makes us translators.
Okay, this has come up. Time's up. But I think quickly, if somebody can add to that.
I could just add that, I mean, obviously lots of people learn about translation concepts and theory, and especially at sort of university level and postgraduate. But like I said, in the UK, these organizations, the British Centre for Literary Translation, they run so many brilliant things like the summer school, and I'm leading a workshop this summer for multilingual prose, and it's open to people from all over the world. And they're primarily like editing workshops. So a bit like, with writing, you learn how to edit yourself, so the teaching comes from kind of learning and workshopping and understanding what works and what doesn't work.
So it is helpful.
I think you learn through practice the most, but I think
so,
that
yeah.
courses certainly help because they also show you different ways, and also they challenge you with something that you
The
haven't
technique
thought
of
about
it.
previously.
Yes.
Well, I've taught translation studies for years, and you can set the stage for someone
Right.
to become a translator. And you can, workshopping and all of that, you can set the stage. Ultimately, the person has to find their own way.
Yeah.
But I think you can enable it. And I think collaborative translation, particularly in a multilingual culture like ours, is very important. I was part of one such project where a single poem of Qazi Nazrul Islam was taken up for translation, his most famous poem, by translators from different, which is Bidrohi, the rebel. And that was taken up for translation by translators across, I think, 15 or 16 languages. And they all brought their first draft to the table and compared notes, and a kind of collaborative project happened, which was very, very rich and fruitful.
Yeah.
And no two translations were the same, but because everybody was making a different meaning out of it and in their own language.